Okay, so as we're talking about intersectionality, what I'm also starting to think about is the ways that organizations, especially in the 80s, when there was a push for more diversity and more gender diversity, the ways that intersectionality was not considered, right? And so the push for diversity and we need more women and let's get more women really defaulted to white women, right?
Yeah.
And not considering all women. And so I'm kind of curious just to hear from your perspectives how organizations and people managers can really put policies and practices in place so that when we are trying to expand gender inclusion, that we are considering all genders.
Can I go first? I have an opinion on this one. So I want to back up for a second. And I think it's really important also that we talk about how this idea about representation and representation of women tends to center white women unless you really explicitly say we want to center all women, which includes, we've already talked about this, women of color, queer women, women with disabilities, right? So, you know, when we know we're in a system that basically prioritizes Eurocentric, you know, masculine, heteronormative, right? It centers that strategy or the sort of those identities. And so white women are the closest in proximity to, I will say hetero cis white women are the closest in proximity to Eurocentric masculine, right? Heteronormative men. And so when we think about that proximity and we think about the systems that benefit really sort of whiteness, and we talk about representation and this push to bring in representation, it's really easy for the system to just say, hey, great, I'm built around the structure, I prioritize these attributes, I'm gonna like expand it a little bit to look at gender, but that gender still is gonna fit within these basic attributes. And that, to a certain extent, is why this idea of representation, particularly around gender, can honestly, I think, actually be in some ways more damaging, because it just continues to reinforce bias built into the system than if we're really intentional and say, hey, when we talk about women, we're talking about, you know, all women. And Tiffany and I've had this conversation because, you know, I was talking to a colleague, I don't know, a year ago, and we were talking about programming. A white woman, she was like, oh, so glad there's an event finally that's for me. I was like, wait, what do you mean? I don't understand. We've had a lot of events for women. And she was like, yeah, but they're for Black or African American women or Hispanic Latino. I'm like, they're for women. Like, they're for women. You're a woman. So, you know, even this whole idea. So when we talk about sort of policy and practice, I think it's important that we explain why this idea of representation around gender can actually, I think, be culturally damaging if we're not really thoughtful about how we're defining it and how we think about including all women. And that means actually, honestly, intentionally, I think, prioritizing women from historically marginalized communities, and at least we're like really centering that intentionally. So, you know, that being said, when, you know, we think about policy, when we think about practices, policy is really tricky, right? You just mentioned this a moment ago. Affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy. EEOC has policies. We are bound by those policies. You know, we could have a completely separate conversation on the Supreme Court's, you know, decisions and what will happen in academic environments, how that will impact then private industry, how that will impact the work that we do. So I'm going to just pause on that because that's an entirely separate conversation. But policy can drive behavior to a certain extent because it measures us. And there is some policy that holds us accountable. You know, the federal policies that govern us, you know, like really help drive, I think, many of our people strategies. But I think we have to really think differently between policy and practice. So if we acknowledge that this idea that practice can help remove discrimination in the work environment by not addressing it, sort of, we talked about this more broadly in society, that we can do things in a vacuum in our work environment that we cannot do more broadly, I think is really challenging. And, you know, I know I'm going a little bit sideways, but it also sort of reinforces this idea, like we want to believe that when people come to work, they leave everything behind. We talk about this with the Buffalo Massacre. Like, oh, okay, you know what, just come to work, it's cool, like be in your work environment, do your thing, leave that trauma behind, and then I guess go back to that trauma when you leave work. Like, I'm not certain what the expectation was, but like it doesn't work that way. And so I think it's the same way around policy and practice. This is sort of that debate of, do you drive behavior or do you drive belief? Well, I will say from my point of view, and Tiffany and I don't always agree on this. My point of view is, in a business, you drive behavior and you measure that behavior and you hold people accountable to that behavior. And my hope is, by measuring and holding people accountable to that behavior, there's some muscle memory, and eventually they will start to see the benefit. Driving belief without addressing some of the broader issues, right, within society, I think is very difficult. So how do you address some of the issues around intersectionality, representation, inclusion, engagement? My point of view is, you measure people and you hold them accountable and you tie their comp to it and you tie the company's performance to it.
So Tiffany, I want to ask you to weigh in, but real quick, Tali, you mentioned it, like one concrete example of like tying comp to it. What else would you recommend in terms of kind of your perspective of emphasizing behavior? What else would you recommend for people managers or organizations to do to really kind of create an inclusive?
So, I mean, I think there's like setting KPIs, setting metrics, goals, measuring them, tying it to performance evaluation. But I also think there's, what is your CEO saying? What is your operating committee saying? What is your board saying? Are they, like, every time there's a town hall, every time there's a global meeting, are they talking about the importance of this? So from the top, is it part of every single conversation? And are they commenting about what's happening in the world, recognizing that we don't have a wall between what happens at home and happens in the office? And then everybody throughout the organization, like, make it an expectation that every conversation, not literally, like, obviously common sense, but team meetings, town halls, Ask Me Anythings, that they always touch on the importance of this topic. You start to reinforce then the cultural aspect of it. And I think you're sort of like, that's a way you can start to try to drive culture and belief, and you measure and you hold people accountable through the behavioral aspects.
Thank you. Tiffany, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Oh my goodness. So it's funny, Tali, I was sitting here, I was like, oh, I hope she brings up the changing behavior versus changing belief and how they're connected. And I was sitting here, I was like, please bring it up.
I got you.
Thank you. But no, honestly, I mean, there's so much that Tali said that was so comprehensive that I think is really just a really fantastic example. I do wonder, I shouldn't say wonder, I do get sometimes concerned that when organizations do tie these sorts of, inclusive practices to compensation, right? That the behavior is solely driven for profit and not necessarily meant to inspire change in belief. And as a woman of color, I truly believe in my heart of hearts, unless I can change your belief, I may change behavior temporarily in the short term, but I don't believe that it's going to necessarily be sustained in a way that actually truly changes. It's almost like, do you want people to change or do you want people to perform? And there's some places that might be okay with that, and they use it interchangeably as long as it happens and it gets done. But I know for, people like Tali and myself, that we're not just looking for people to perform and do really good for 365 days, but really commit to this, that whether or not they are in the walls of their employer, whether or not they're in the walls of their church, of their community organization, of the store, whatever space that they're in, that they actually uphold those inclusive practices no matter where they go. And that's way harder to achieve when there's no compensation tied to it.
Very true. When I think of kind of belief and behavior, I think the uniqueness of the workplace is that in some ways it can regulate behavior that other places can't. Exactly. So being able to exercise that power, and to your point, Tiffany, it doesn't necessarily mean people believe it or buy into it. And then there is the inauthenticity. It does feel inauthentic, right? If it's just the action. And so I'll tell you my hope, my belief, my thought is that when people change their behavior, even if it's just because of compensation, that over time, that does become integrated into a new belief system. Because if they're starting to interact with more people and different perspectives, on a regularly consistent basis, then it starts expanding their thinking of like, oh, maybe how I was raised isn't how I want to continue to think.
Yeah.
Or they leave the organization because the behavior change becomes too much, because it goes against their beliefs so much that they're not willing to change their beliefs. So that's kind of how I like to think of them working together.